So we are going to start our look at the genetics module next. And genetics has some vocabulary that we want to make sure that we understand as we get started with it. So to introduce this and then to get into our first set of crosses and kind of working through things, this is very practice and hands-on related. We want to get through some of those basic vocabulary items. So the first piece of basic vocabulary that you are going to run across is the word gamete. And gamete basically refers to any of the sex cells. These are sperm or egg. And what you have to remember, and this will be in the cell growth and reproduction unit, but these are formed by the process of meiosis or gametogenesis. And they contain half of the genetic information of a normal body cell. And these were actually used by Gregor Mendel with pea plants, and he basically determined that the gametes are the ones that carry the traits that get passed on from generation to generation. And he termed these factors, which we now call genes. So these factors are what determine traits that we see in ourselves. We also will talk a lot about alleles. Alleles are basically different forms of genes. So, if you look at somebody's height, there are different height combinations. There's different eye colors. There's different flower colors in plants. So these are the different forms of the genes that are present or that can be present in an individual. What you have to remember is every individual has 2 alleles for each trait. So there's in their genetic makeup, there's 2 alleles. Now these can be the same, they can be different. It just depends on the genetic combination because you get one of those alleles from mom and one of those alleles from dad. And when you combine the alleles, you create your genotype. That is your actual genetic makeup. Now, this isn't always obvious because sometimes some of the genes are hidden and they're covered up, and we're going to be talking about that today. So there are 2 options with your genetic makeup. Those alleles can be the same, so that would be homozygous or pure, and so that is when they are the same. Or the other possibility, since we have 2, is they can be different, and that would be heterozygous or hybrid. Now, what we typically deal with most when we're actually looking at organisms is not their genotype, because we can't see that, but it's their phenotype, which is their physical appearance. So what do we actually see? Do we see blue eyes? Do we see brown eyes? Do we see pink flowers? Do we see yellow flowers? What do we actually see? So those are some of my examples: blue eyes and black hair. And we're going to be working with this different vocabulary as we go through some of the different traits here with this section on Mendelian genetics. So Gregor Mendel, as you know, was a monk, and he actually is like the father of modern genetics. So he came up with the first principle that we're going to look at, which is the principle of dominance, which basically states that some of these alleles are dominant, they're really hefty and strong, and others are recessive or kind of wimpy. And what happens is the dominant alleles overpower the recessive alleles if you're heterozygous. So if I have a dominant allele and a recessive allele, I'm not going to see that recessive appear. My phenotype, my physical appearance, is only going to be that of the dominant. So, for example, we're going to say capital B represents the dominant allele, which is black. Lowercase b represents the recessive allele, which is white. Now, when we're doing this, we have to remember that the letter identifying the allele comes from the dominant trait. So I wouldn't want to use capital W and small w because black begins with B, and so we make that the capital B, and the recessive one is the lowercase b. So then we can look at our different combinations that we can have. So if I have a genotype of capital B, that would be homozygous dominant, because both of them are the dominant gene. If I have capital B, little b, I would be homozygous recessive. And if I have, heterozygous, and then if I have little b, I will be homozygous. They're the same, but this time they are not dominant, they are the recessive allele. So what would we see physically on the outside? Well, with capital B, both of those make black. With capital B, the black overpowers the white, and we will see black. And then with little b, we will see white because both of those alleles are for the white color. Now, Mendel also used the principle of segregation, which basically says that during the process of gametogenesis or meiosis, we separate the alleles, and then we create new combinations during fertilization. And so this is what we actually, this actually shows why recessive traits will disappear in one generation and then reappear in the next. And we'll take a look at that a little bit in some of the practice things. So we can actually see this principle of segregation in a Punnett square. So let's say, for example, I have tall and short. And so tall is dominant and short is recessive. And I have one parent who is homozygous dominant, tall, so I would have big T, and notice here how it is separated. They're not together because in each sperm or egg, it doesn't really matter which, it's only going to get one copy. So one copy, if I split it apart, one's going to be a big T, the other one's also going to be a big T. Let's say that the other parent is tall, but they're heterozygous. So when it separates, it would be big T, little t, okay? So one option is that the gamete will carry the tall gene, but the other is that it will carry the short gene. And then what we do is we combine them in these squares. So we bring the big T down. So this represents segregation. And then what we do is we combine them. So we take this big T and we combine it here. And then we take this big T and combine it there. Now in this bottom square, we bring down the big T and we bring over the little t for that combination. And then again, we do that. This is fertilization. So if these two individuals were to mate, those are the possible combinations that would happen with this particular gene as a result of fertilization. We can then look at the percentages or the ratios of what the offspring should be. So we would see 50% homozygous dominant and 50% heterozygous. They would 100% be tall. So you have to look, is it asking genotype or is it asking phenotype? If it's genotype, it's looking for homozygous, heterozygous, dominant recessive thing. If you're looking at phenotype, you're looking at the physical appearance. So all of these offspring should be tall. Now, that's the end of that. There's a couple of other video clips in here that you need to watch, and then you'll want to watch the video on kind of explaining how to do the practice worksheet for these types of traits.